So a little bit about me. My family came in 1975, shortly after the war ended in Saigon. They all left from there, and then they got shipped into Camp Pendleton. They got shipped into Fort Indiantown Gap in Pennsylvania, out in the middle of nowhere. And I was born maybe 8 weeks after they arrived at Fort Indiantown Gap. After they they got settled into Fort Indiantown Gap in a small town called Chambersburg is where I was born. They were like, this is not what we want in our life for the next 50 years on earth. So they decided that they are city people and they had to do everything in their power to get out of Chambersburg, which is a small town in Pennsylvania. My mother had a younger brother who lived in LA at the time. And she's like, hey, there's a lot happening out here in LA. You should get everybody to move out here. Bring the whole family out to LA. This is Saigon. This is modern day Saigon. There's a lot going on. So it took them about a year. They made stops in Ohio, in Texas, and finally they arrived in LA. I'm not sure why they didn't decide to live in Orange County, but I think that they kind of wanted to be in LA, which is the big city here in Southern California. So we arrived here in 1976 and we stayed till today. This is where I grew up. The first 25 years of my life was spent in Koreatown. And, I joined the Marine Corps at 17. So I would go back and forth from San Diego to LA. I did some time at USC. So I lived off campus, not with my family at the time, but in Koreatown. So not too far from where I grew up. We arrived in LA in 1976, and my mom and her younger brother, another brother, found work as seamstress. They were people who were seamstress in Vietnam, and they found like these interior designers, a couple of people that were into like upholstery and drapery work and pillow work. And so my mom and her younger brother were taking work home, and they were making these things on the first floor of the house that they bought or that they rented. And over the years, doing these piecemeal work, they would walk around. My mom and dad would walk around the neighborhood, and they found that there was this drapery store that was making these beautiful drapes. And my mom and dad were like, that seemed like a really cool business, because my mom's background is, sewing. So they looked into how to make all kinds of window coverings, like bespoke window coverings, like fabric Roman shades, draperies, curtain, valances, you name it. If it was bespoke and fabric, they found a way to do it. And so they did it. And eventually their clientele builds up into a robust business with interior designers all over Southern California. And the majority of them were interior designers to celebrities and to the stars here in LA, to very rich people. And I grew up going to these homes here in LA to put window coverings up. And one of the first stories that I could tell you about the actual what the hell am I doing here moment in the business was, I think it was like 12, 13 years old. And I was carrying a ladder into this house. And I think I was carrying the ladders up into this house, and right in the middle of the foyer was this big statue. I mean, it was maybe 20 feet, because it was like Gone with the Wind, wrapping a staircase. And there was this huge bronze statue in the middle of a boxer. And this bronze statue was of a boxer that really reminded me of a movie that I just watched not too long ago. And I kept staring at the statue, and I realized it was Sylvester Stallone. And I was like, that's weird. We're in a house with Sylvester Stallone's bronze in the middle of the foyer going up the stairs. And then I walk into the master bedroom, and along the halls, there's all of these like sort of hand-painted pictures of Sylvester Stallone. And I realized this was Sylvester Stallone, the guy from Rocky's house. And I don't know what happened in me that day, but I had this weird feeling like I was the help. And everything sort of changed from that point on in my head going forward. I was like, this is the weirdest thing. I feel like the help. I didn't know how to explain it at the time, but I knew that I didn't like it. And I don't know if I didn't like it because I felt like the help, or it was just like, oh, I had to go working for my mom and dad at 12 and 13 years old. So throughout the next few years, we would do all these homes. And sometimes there were celebrities that I would recognize. Sometimes they were not. Sometimes they were just like rich oil tycoons from Saudi Arabia. It was all over the map. Like the kind of clienteles that we had were all over the place. So my family did that for many, many, many years. And I, at 17, really did not know what I wanted to do. And I happened to graduate high school at 16. I didn't have great grades, but I was very ambitious. I just wanted to be done with high school. And when I turned 17, that year, I was walking along one of these debt festivals in Orange County, Little Saigon. And it was in the early years. And I walked with my brother and a group of friends. And we're marching along, walking along. And to the right, I remember there's like these guys that were dressed in beautiful uniforms. And I tilted my head to look at them. And they go, come here. And my brother and I were startled. And then they start to giggle. It was like funny. It was a funny thing, funny moment. We walked over there. And it was a Marine Corps recruiter named Staff Sergeant Hip Wynn. And I'll never forget. He was really charming. And he basically started to question my brother and I, like, what were our future plans and what do we want to do with our lives? I remember saying, like, nothing. I just want to get through, community college, and we have no real direction. So he said, why don't you come in and have a conversation with me, and I'll tell you about some options in the Marine Corps. So my brother and I went to the recruiting office in Orange County, didn't tell my mom and dad. We showed up, and he found out I was 17, and he said, well, I'm going to have to go talk to your mom and dad. Can you set that up? And I ended up setting it up with my mom and dad. And my mom's biggest gripe was like, wait a minute. We all leave Vietnam, so our son's future is to not fight in another war, is to not carry guns. And here we are. You're thinking about joining the Marine Corps. Like, this is a complete. This is actually hurtful to my mom and dad. And so he said, you know what? The recruiter said, you know what? I can make sure, or try to like ensure, they pick a specialty that does not go to war. And I think for the most part, he kind of like honored what he said. He put me as an admin clerk, which is like, really handling paperwork and things that happen in an office. My brother was on the wing, so he ultimately became like a jet wing mechanic. So we didn't really see the battlefront, or we weren't really set up for that. However, in the Marine Corps, that's not how it works. Once you get in, you realize that everybody goes to war. If you're an admin clerk, you are on the field training, and you're qualifying for the rifle every year. You have to go PT, physical train with your whole company day in and day out. It's not like you're not. They always want you in the Marine Corps to be battle ready. So whether you're an admin clerk, supply clerk, transpo clerk, you're always ready to go into battle with anybody. If they call you out, you're going to go. So thankfully, I wasn't in that situation. I was able to finish a degree while I was in the Marine Corps, stationed in San Diego. I would come back and forth up and down San Diego to LA during the last 3 years of my Marine Corps enlistment. But the first year I was in Japan. So finally, when I got back out of the Marine Corps, I got to USC, and I was an econ major, maybe trying to get to law school. I wasn't sure. But at that point, I knew that the discipline that I got in the Marine Corps was going to really energize me to kind of really put my foot down and head down and march full steam ahead with a career in something beyond what I thought growing up. So I was like, all right, I probably end up going to law school. So I picked the econ major. I got to USC, and my brother and I, my brother was still a year away from getting to USC. It was his last year in the service, because he did 5 years as a jet engine mechanic. I only had to do 4. So I ended up doing 1 semester at USC, my first semester, and then I met somebody at UCLA, crosstown rival. It was a Vietnamese girl, and we had dated, and she had mentioned the fact that there's no Vietnamese restaurants at the Westwood Village. And I grew up going to Westwood Village to hang draperies with my mom and dad. And I was like, all right, you're right. And there was like this huge amount of Vietnamese students in the late 90s that were starting to show up at USC and UCLA. So I took a year off. I told my mom, hey, why don't we create this restaurant? I want to have a restaurant, a Vietnamese restaurant, see if we can have a go at it. I did that for about a year. Then my mom had some brothers that were coming from Vietnam, had no work to do. And she's like, look, you already have your taste of what it feels like to run a restaurant, to own one. Why don't you go back to school? Why don't you go back to USC? Because I deferred my my registration for my first year. And so I said, okay, fine. And then so I handed the keys back to my uncles. I went back to school. And then my brother had just come out of the Marine Corps. And so we both landed at USC at the same time. We both do USC together, and we get heavily involved into the VSA, the Vietnamese Student Association at USC. And what ends up happening is that my brother, becomes like one of these charismatic leaders. Everybody loves him. And he gets voted into becoming the president of the Vietnamese Student Association at USC. We meet this one guy, this Vietnamese guy, his name is Quang Nguyen, ends up becoming a director in the future. But at the time he was studying for an MFA at USC for screenwriting. And we didn't know it at the time, but in order to get a MFA at USC for anything film related, whether it's production writing, screenwriting, you had to be hot shit because you had to apply to this school. USC happens to be the oldest film school in the world. Like, I think it at the dawn of like film civilization, USC showed up on the circuit as the first official film school. So it has this long legacy. I didn't know this. So I was hanging out with this fellow student, and we were about the same age because he was doing a graduate MFA program, and my brother and I were both a little bit older because we had done the Marine Corps. So we were like a little bit older students hanging out with all these young people at school. So we were a good 3-4 years ahead of everybody. And Quan and I and my brother were around the same age. So we hung out a lot. We would go to clubs a lot because we would just sort of like, that's what you did in LA at the time. And we were older. We were all above 21. And so Qua said, after hanging out with me for a couple of months, he said, hey, have you ever thought about becoming a film producer? And I said, no, I don't even know what that is. And he started to break it down. He's like, they're basically glorified project managers at the bottom level. You kind of like figure out how to keep a production moving, or you find money for it, or you develop stories. And, there's all kinds of producers that exist. So he started breaking down, but he goes, if you really want to get to know the business, you should join an agency. And at the time I was reading a lot, watching a lot of movies. And he said, why don't you look into becoming a literary agent? That way you could read a lot of scripts. You could be on a desk and you could answer phones for an agent and learn the business and learn what makes a good story. So I did that. I did that for a few years. I started during my last year at USC and carried on for a few years, worked at lit agencies as well as production companies to get sort of a feel for everything. And I continued doing that. And I worked on some sets and stuff like that. And then 2001, 9/11 happens. And at that time, I had been taking some music classes and singing, and I was really into it, and I was doing film. And I said to myself, the world kind of stopped. The world can end now. I want to at least give singing a shot. So I went back to school at the Musicians Institute in Hollywood. And I studied vocal. I learned how to sing at MI. And in this singing program, you have to take all these electives too. I learned how to play piano. I learned music theory. I learned all kinds of different styles of singing. And so that time at the Musicians Institute sort of like made me understand that there's all kinds of levels to music. And it sort of put me on the road to pursuing a music career. So I spent about 6 years pursuing music and thinking like this is the best ever. And at that point, 99% of my friends came from the Vietnamese film groups. There were senior directors that were like a little bit older, like the Bui brothers. And I would hang out with guys like Ham and Stefan Gauger at the time. And so all of these Vietnamese filmmakers, and there were a lot of other filmmakers that were, in my circles at the time, they were all friends. But they were like really cool. We still hung out, although I wasn't pursuing the film path during that time. I was doing part-time work with my mom and dad at the window coverings business. And that pattern would continue on for a long time until the Great Recession of 2008. At around 2008, the interior design world collapsed because the luxury goods were like, they were the first to go. And so for 2 to 3 years, I was struggling in the window coverings business as I was doing all this film work on the side, and I didn't know what to do. And somebody in the film business, my dear friend Anderson Lay, who I just sort of met at the time, he said, hey, there is this thing called the 626 night market happening. And it was like the inaugural one in 2012. He goes, and I had cooked for all of our friends at one point or another. He goes, you should look into making food and creating a food booth at the 626 night market. And during that time, I had some cooking experience, but not enough to sort of really put myself in a business situation when making food. So a friend of mine said, hey, why don't you pair up with this chef and I'll let you cook weekly at a booth at the Hollywood Yamashiro's Farmers Market. Shout out to my boy Nick Spano at the time. And Nick said, why don't you team up with this Japanese chef? He'll teach you how to cook, and he doesn't speak very much English, a lot of English. So you can help him with the business side. He'll teach you how to cook. So he and I created this sort of yakitori program on the side of Yamashiro's. We were making food. That then led to Anderson telling me about the 2012 inaugural 626 night market. So I was really getting to the food business. And at the time, the window coverings business and the factory that we had created early in the 2000s was struggling. And so I now was making enough money to send back to Vietnam from the food business. So I now had the film world, like, moonlighting in the film world, doing that as a sort of helping out my buddies in the film business with distribution and finance. I was doing food, and then I was doing manufacturing in Vietnam. Those three things sort of really defined my life from 2012 to 2022. I did all three of those things, and I did well. 2 businesses, and on the side I was doing film. And during those years, film for me didn't make money. I mean, I get paid for jobs here and there, but really the bulk of my money really came in the food world. And obviously the factory in Vietnam began to kind of recuperate, and by 2014 we're doing pretty well. Cut to the pandemic. We went through this slow period with the food and window coverings business. And during the food business and the height of it around 2015, some of my friends were sort of telling me to start tuning into podcasts. This is when I started to become made aware of podcasts. So around 2015, I started to really get into podcasting and listening to podcasts and consuming podcasts as I am driving all over town to go to meetings for the window coverings business and for food businesses during the summer and the weekends. I just started listening to podcasts like nonstop and really going, I could probably do this one day in my life. And I really started to really think about like, how would approach this? And I had a few heroes that were beginning to grow their podcasts, in the mainstream. And I just started to study them and really follow them and really learn and put myself in that situation and their shoes going, I could do this one day. But I was always afraid to start because I just didn't want to start another thing. I didn't want to start another business. And frankly, the biggest thing that scared me was the technology part. I sucked at camera work. I sucked at computer editing, anything that has to do with like technical skills. I just always opted out of not learning it. So the pandemic happened, and now the food business was out of commission for a little bit. The window coverings business slowed down quite a bit. And I began to notice that all these high school kids were like learning and recording their lessons from high school on Zoom, which is like through their laptops, and they were recording it. And I was like paying attention to this time, and I was like, wait a minute, if they could do that, and all these podcasters were like doing their stuff on Zoom because they couldn't do it in person, I was like, let me learn how to do this on Zoom. So I learned it at the start of 2020, learned what I could do to kind of like put something together. And by October 2020, that's when I kicked off my first one with my brother. And he and I had episode 1. I talked to him about his business At that time, he had probably been living in Vietnam for about 16 years now at that point. So he had a lot that I wanted to get to know. And there's a lot of things I didn't know about his business. So I started there, and then I started to go to my cousin, who was an MMA fighter. She's Andy Wynn. She's an MMA fighter. And then I started to talk to my partners at East Films, and started to slowly build out a guest list of all the people and guests that could have possibly become guests on the podcast. And from that point, that's where the birth of the podcast happened for me, which is the beginning of 2020, and still being in COVID, growing into this sort of comfort level with technology. And then starting in October, at the end of October, shooting that first episode with my brother. So by the time January came around, I had recorded 20 and loaded, I think I'd loaded about 10 episodes onto YouTube and an RSS feed at the time with Buzzsprout or something like that. I had loaded it up and let 10 episodes rip. By January 19th, I went on a hike with two of my friends, Michael Din and director Bao Win, and up this mountain at 6:30 in the morning, I broke my leg. And up at that point, I'd recorded 20 episodes, and I broke my leg, and I had all this like weird unfinished business with the night market and with my window coverings business. And I was in bed for the next 12 weeks, the doctor said. That was going to be my sort of like, I needed to be in bed for 12 weeks before I could even walk and heal. So while I was in bed, I began to reach out to everyone I knew. If they had a story or if they were in an interesting career, I would reach out and say, hey, I started this podcast. Here's the first 10 episodes on YouTube. I'd like to invite you on to the show. And this is how I built it. For 12 weeks, different friends of mine had began to introduce me to different friends, and I began to expand. And I knew that after 12 weeks, I should have all these people researched and ready to go by the time I'm ready to walk and be in a studio to record. So what I did was I lined up in those 12 weeks, I lined another 50 guests up. So as soon as I was able to walk, which I think I began to be able to walk like at week 8 or 9, I started to line up all the guests, and we started to begin to record. And I wasn't fully out of the cast for, I don't know, months, but I was able to walk into the studio and shoot at my desk for the next year. And that's how this podcast began. And in the next episodes, I'll talk more about like the criteria for how I pick out guests, how I prepare for the podcast, how the podcast has changed my life. I'll probably even get into like episodes of talking about like why I think every Vietnamese person should have a podcast. I'll make a case for that, and other episodes that are related to the Vietnamese podcast. So thank you so much for joining me and hearing me talk today.